Hello friends, welcome to my channel Igno Center. So friends, today we will going to deal with MEG 05 solve assignment. So friends, this assignment will help for July 2022 and January 2023 session, and the part is 01 of the video, and we will deal with literary criticism and theory MEG 05. So let me read the question once for you, which will be gonna deal in today's session. So here you have to answer all the question. Each questions carry 20 marks. So friends, before moving to our question, I have to request you all that please make subscribe to my channel, so that I will also get encouraged to make more videos to you all, and which is also going to help you all. And if you are new to our channel, please make subscribe to our channel, and in the given description box you will get a link of my vlog channel, where you can able to see me with beautiful views and the places where I visit. So make subscribe to there too, and if you get time, please watch that too. So let's move to our question now. So here in today's session we will going to discuss with question number 1. Discuss Aristotle view of literature as imitation. And question number 2. What do Wordsworth and Coleridge have to say on poetic diction? So friend, today we will going to deal with these two questions, and in the next part we will going to discuss with rest of the question. So let's move to our question now. As you see here, it was a little blur, so I hope you may able to understand when you watch this. So here we will going to deal with question number 1 and question number 2. As I have already read the question for you all, just look at it and compare that the question is the same, and let's move to the answer now. So here is our question number 1, and the question is discuss Aristotle's view of literature as imitation. And the answer for this question is, though Plato did not appreciate poetry, but his disciple Aristotle had a great respect for poets, and tragic poets in specific. For him, tragic poetry was greater than even that of the epic. Aristotle modified the existing order about the poetry to form his own perception about it, and in the perception Homer and Hesiod were at the top. Aristotle puts his idea in a very logical manner to redefine the case of the theatre. He also argued that tragedy is the most sublime of all the genres. What we need to look at is the contribution of Aristotle in revealing the tragic performance, and by extension the theatre as a complete art. The art which not only consists of dialogue, character and plot, but also the element of spectacles of music and dance. In fact, it would be injustice to say that he considered tragedy higher than epic, because tragedy has all these elements, as he say. Because it has all the epic element, it may even use the epic meter with music and spectacular visual effect as important accessories. and this produces the most vivid pleasure. Poetic 24:4. It has often been considered that we do not have much access to Aristotelian view on other form of art like comedy, as the extant text of Poetic is not complete, but we still have the opening where in Aristotle talks about the overall view of art, considering the mimetic representation and theoretical practice. We can say that whatever applies to tragedy also must go smoothly with comedy and stir. In Poetic, Aristotle starts by praising the method of mimesis or representation of art. He then talks about the rhyme, rhythm, language, and harmony, and how they are responsible to make an artistic representation possible. Aristotle claims that all forms of art like epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, dithyrambic poetry, flute, or lyre playing are all the modes of mimesis. But in all these cases, the mimesis is achieved in different manner. Aristotle says that all the mediums of mimesis are manifested in the six elements of tragedy, which are myth or plot, ethos or the character, dianoia or argument, lesis or diction, melopea or music, and opsis or visual spectacles. All these elements of the tragedy can also be found in comedy and other forms, as we will see later. Aristotle states that all human actions are mimetic and that man learns through imitation. In particular, mimesis is the distinguishing qualities of an artist. He argues that public classifies all those who write in meter as poet and completely misses the point that the capacity to produce an imitation is the essential quality of the poet. The poet is distinguished from the rest of mankind with the essential ability to produce imitation. A poet may imitate in one of three styles in poetry. He may use pure native narrative, in which he speaks in his own person without imitation, as in the dithyrambics, or he may use mimetic narrative and speaks in the person of his character, as in comedy and tragedy. A poet may use mixed narrative in which he speaks now in his own person and now in the person of his character, as in epic poetry. Mimetic poetry may also differ according to the object of imitation. In this respect, tragedy differs from comedy in that it makes its character better rather than worse. Mimesis particularly becomes a central term when Aristotle discusses the nature and function of art. In the Poetic, he defines tragedy as an imitation of human action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. In language embellished with every kind of artistic ornament, the various kind being found in different parts of the play. It represents man in action rather then using narrative through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation of this emotion. Aristotle is interested in the form of imitation and goes on to consider plot, character, diction, thought, spectacles, and song as consisting element of a typical tragedy. The action of plot must be complete in itself with a proper beginning, middle, and an end. All part of action must be equally essential to the whole. Each part of the tragedy is imitation itself. Character in tragedy imitates the action of noble man who has to be a man of some social standing and personal reputation, but he has to be presented as in terms of his weakness because it is his weakness that will make his fall believable. Aristotle thinks that all this type of art are mimetic, but each may differ in terms of manner, means, and object of imitation. Music imitates in sound and rhythm, painting in color, and poetry in action and words. Aristotle mimesis does not refer to the imitation of ideas and appearance. Like that of Plato, he argued that each area of knowledge is imitation in the sense that as a human being we all learn through imitation. However, he carefully make a distinction distinction between different kind of knowledge. For instance, he claims that art and philosophy deals with different kind of truth. Philosophy deals with concrete and absolute truth, whereas art deals with aesthetic and universal truth. The difference, for instance, between mimetic poetry and history is stated as one writes about what has actually happened, while the other deals with what might happen. Art, unlike science, does not abstract universal form, but imitates the form of individual things and unites the separate part, presenting what is universal and particular. Therefore, the function of poetry is not to portray what happened, but to portray what may happen in accord with the principle of probability and necessity. Since poetry deals with universal truth, history considers only particular fact. Poetry is more philosophical and deserves more serious attention. In addition, aesthetic representation of realism is not technical, factual, philosophical, and historical. Aristotle compares aesthetic process mimesis with the process that take place in nature. While nature moves through internal principle, art moves through organic principle like plot, action, character, diction, and there is a unity among them. In a sense, art imitates nature and the deficiencies of nature are supplemented in the process of imitation, and art follows the same method as nature would have employed. Thus, if a house were natural product, it would pass through the same stage that in fact it passed through when it is produced by art. They would move along the same lines the nature process actually takes. Poets like nature are capable of creating matter and form. The origin of nature is nature. itself, and the origin of art is the artistic, and the defining characteristic of the artistic is the ability to create through imitation as nature does. The artistic constructs the plot as an organizing principle. Character constitutes the relation and carries on the action, and style gives pleasure. Mimesis and Aristotle take it is an active aesthetic process. He argued that imitation is given us by nature, and men are endowed with this gift, gradually develop them, and finally create the art of poetry. The poet does not imitate reality, but bring reality into existence. Through mimesis, the poet recreates and recognizes already known facts and presents them in a fresh and attractive way. Therefore, through audience know the story of Sophocles' Oedipus, they go and watch it. The reality as presented to us through mimesis is superior and universal, not only because we are pleased to learn through imitation, but also because such reality is better. Homer, for instance, depicts Achilles not only as a bad character but also depicts his goodness. Mimesis is thus copying and changing. The poet creates something that previously did not exist and for which there are no available models. Even in dealing with historical materials, the poet needs to fashion it in account with his art rising to a higher level than is found in reality. Art is fictitious, but the mimetic and aesthetic nature of art pervades the fictitious deviation, and a work of art forces the thing to appear as something more beautiful and better than the nature and human being possess in common, for it is always writer's duty to make world better. So friends, till here we have completed with question number one, and I have written it for too long, so I hope you understand my efforts and make subscribe to my channel. And if you're getting time, please go to description box and there you get my vlog channel link, so please make subscribe on that too. It will be a great help for me, as I am doing help to you all by just giving a time on this and read all the things for you all only. So hope you may also help me by subscribing my channel, and in the given box you will also get my another channel link. Please make subscribe that too. So let's move to question number two now. So here is the question: what do Wordsworth and Coleridge have to say on poetic diction? So the answer for this question is: it has been generally supposed that Wordsworth's theory of poetic language is merely a reaction against and criticism of the pseudo-classical theory of poetic diction, but such a view is partially true. His first impulse was less a revolt against pseudo-classical diction than a desire to find a suitable language for the new territory of human life which he was conquering for poetic treatment. His aim was to deal in his poetry with rustic and humble life, and to advocate simplicity of theme. Moreover, he believed that the poet is essentially a man speaking to man, and so he must use a language as is used by man. The pseudo classics advocate that the language of poetry is different from the language of prose, while Wordsworth believed that there is no essential differences between them. The poet can communicate best in the language which is really used by man. He condemns the artificial language. Thus, William Wordsworth preferred the language really used by common man. Wordsworth proposed, as he tells in the preface, was to choose incidents and situations for common life, and quite naturally, he also intended to use a section of language really used by man. He was to deal with humble and rustic life, and so he should also use the language of the rustic farmer shepherd who were to be the subject of his poetry. The language of this man was to be used, but was to be purified of all that is painful or disgusting, vulgar, and coarse in that language. He was to use the language of real men because the aim of a poet is to give pleasure, and such language without selection with cause disgust. Wordsworth was primarily a poet who had to become a critic by necessity. The new experiment which he had made in the lyrical ballad 1798 called forth a systematic defense of the theory upon which the poems were written. Wordsworth protested against the tradition and usage set up by the pseudo-classical school during the 18th century. His view about the language which was to be employed in poetry raised a storm of protest against him, even by such a close friend Coleridge. He said that there could be no essential difference between the language poetry and that of prose. By expounding his theory, Wordsworth did nothing wrong. He simply emphasized the use of a simpler language well with the reach of the cottagers and shepherd about whom he was composing his poem. Poetry was now coming out of the narrow groups of town life and was embracing the life of nature and humanity in its simplest and most unsophisticated forms. Wordsworth rightly felt that for the new poetry of the new age, a language was needed. What he earnestly felt he expressed in the second preface to the lyrical ballad. The principal object proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and relate or describe them throughout as far as this was possible in a section of language really used by man. Number one, sorry, when we examine Wordsworth's statement regarding poetic diction, the following fact clearly catches our attention. Number one, the language of poetry should be the language really used by man, but it should be a section of such language. All the words used by the poem cannot be employed in poetry. Only some selected words which are used in a common parlance can serve the purpose of poetry. Number two, it should be the language of man in a state of vivid sensation. It means that the language used by people in a state of animation can form the language of poetry. Number three, it should have a certain coloring of imagination. The poet should give the color of imagination to the language employed by him in poetic composition. Number four, there is no essential differences between the words used in prose and in metrical composition. Words of prose and poetry are not clearly demarcated, so that words which can be used in prose can find place in poetry and vice versa. What means is that the words used in conversation, if they are properly selected, would provide the rough framework of the language of poetry. When the poet is truly inspired, his imagination will enable him to select from the language really used by man. These are the four basic principles of Wordsworth theory of poetic diction. Wordsworth followed the main tenets of his theory in some of his poems, but it became pretty difficult for him to stick strictly to his theory. When he came to such splendid poems as Tinter Abbey or Ode on the Intimation of Immorality, etc. Though Wordsworth and Coleridge has become been joint author of the lyrical ballad, Coleridge differed from Wordsworth on some fundamental points. He wanted to clarify his own position. 17 years after the publication of the preface, he took up Wordsworth's theory and analyzed it part by part in his Biographia Literaria. Coleridge wanted to correct Wordsworth's view about the language of poetry being the real language of man in a state of vivid sensation, and also about the suitability of the incidents of common life. As to the falseness and artificiality of much of the neoclassical verse, Coleridge was in complete agreement with Wordsworth, but he would not accept Wordsworth's theory that the ideal language of poetry is the natural conversation of man under the influence of natural feeling. He is of the opinion that only on the ground of differing from the language of real life a poem cannot be condemned, nor could he accept Wordsworth's contention that there neither is nor can be an essential differences between the language of prose and metrical composition. He says that these rules may be applicable only to certain class of poetry and it needed not be practiced as a rule. Wordsworth said he chose rustic life because in that condition the essential passion of the heart find a better soil in which they can attain their maturity, are less restraint and speak a plain and more emphatic language. To disprove this belief of Wordsworth, Coleridge remarked that there is nothing extraordinary, fascinating in the character introduced by Wordsworth. In his own poem, these characters appeal to us not because they are rustic, but because they are what Aristotle called idealized beings. They are persons of a known class, and their manner and sentiment are the natural product of circumstances common to that class. Turning more closely to Wordsworth's statement that the language too of this man is adopted because such men hourly communicate with the base object from which the best part of language is originally derived, and because from their rank in society and the sameness and narrow circle of their intercourse being less under the action of social vanity, they convey their feelings and notions in simple and unelaborated expression. Coleridge remarks that a rustic language purified from all provincialism and grossness and reconstructed to be made consistent with the rules of grammar will not differ from the language of any other man of common sense. Thus he denied Wordsworth's main assertion that a special virtue lies in the language of those who are in close touch with nature. He also shows his disagreement with Wordsworth's assertion that from the object with which the rustic hourly communicates, the best part of language is form. His first objection to this statement is that the uneducated rustic would furnish a very scientific vocabulary. Secondly, he denies that the words and their combination derived from the objects with which the rustic is familiar can be justly said to form the best part of language. The best part of human language, Coleridge emphatically says, is derived from reflection on the act of the mind itself. It is formed by a voluntary appropriation of fixed symbols to internal acts to process and reflect process and result of immigration imagination, the greater part of which have no place in the consciousness of uneducated man, though in civilized society by imitation and passive remembrance of what they hear from their religious instructors and superiors, the most uneducated say in the harvest which they never sowed or reaped. Coleridge further says that the language praised so much by Wordsworth varies from locality to locality owing to various influences. He then attacked Wordsworth's conception that Wordsworth would come out of this simple rustic in the moment of natural passion, spontaneously. Actually, the expression depends on the general truth, conception, and images, and was already stored in mind. Giving illustration from Wordsworth's own poem, he disproved Wordsworth's assertion that he was using the language of the rustic. He goes to challenge the last important assertion of Wordsworth. There neither is nor can be any essential differences between the language of prose and metrical composition. He argued that prose itself differs and ought to differ from the language of conversation, just like reading ought to differ from talking. There exists a still greater difference between the order of words used in a poetic composition and that used in prose, unless Wordsworth had only meant words and not the style of using them. So friends, till here we have completed question number 2, and we move to question number 3 in our next part. So I again request you all, if you are new to our channel, just make subscribe to our channel, and if you are not subscribing my another channel, please go to description box and there you find Journey Buddy channel link. So please make subscribe on that too, and make me a help from you all. Thank you.